Good morning. Welcome to church at St. Paul's United Methodist Church. This morning is April 19th, and I am Sue King, the pastor here at St. Paul's, and I welcome you to join us today. I'm going to be going directly to the sermon today, but I invite you to take a look at the complete worship service at our website at www.stpaulsvacaville.com. One of the greatest privileges of being a pastor is being able to share the important moments of people's lives with them and to get to hear their stories about their life and their family, and especially those experiences that they've had along life's pathway. Many times they'll tell me stories of how they felt an encounter with the divine mystery in their life and how their life was changed by their faith. And it's a great privilege to hear those stories. Of course, it's true that I also heard some stories when I was a volunteer and mission leader of teams going to other places, and also as a professor in college. I think it's true that no matter what you do and where you go, people want to tell their stories. And one of the things I've found is that our stories are filled with both positives and negatives, and we'll have pain and suffering and grief and disappointments in our lives and fear. And then at the same time, sometimes even in those very times, we will find peace and love and even joy at moments. And I think that is especially true of Easter stories. And in this time of Easter, we tell a lot of stories, and we find out that the truth of life is that it's a paradox. At the same time, we'll be feeling these feelings, especially in Easter stories, of love and grief, of fear and peace, of disappointment and hope, and of doubt and faith. Today's story is one that you've probably heard before if you've been to church, and maybe if you haven't heard it before, it'll still sound real and truthful to you. Last week, we heard a story about two women named Mary who went to the tomb of Jesus, and they went in fear and in sadness because of what had happened with Jesus being executed, and their fear turned to surprise and then to joy when they encountered the living Christ. In the Gospel of John, which is the gospel that we're also using this morning for the story, that when Mary Magdalene went to tell the disciples what she had seen at the tomb, they didn't believe her. She had said, "I've seen the Lord," and their response, of course, was skepticism, because just as is true today, back then people didn't just raise from the dead, did they? And today's story in chapter 20 of John picks up with those same disciples who didn't believe Mary's story, "I've seen the Lord." They are huddled together behind locked doors in fear, in sadness because of what has happened. They're worried that they're going to get arrested and perhaps executed too. And suddenly Jesus appears to them and he says, "Peace be with you." And then he stretches out his hands to show them his wounds and shows them his side where he was pierced with a sword. And in seeing those evidences of trauma, then they recognize that it is indeed Jesus. And then their fear and astonishment turns to joy. But one of the disciples wasn't there, and that disciple's name was Thomas. And when he hears their story, "We have seen the Lord," echoing what Mary said, he doesn't believe them. He meets that story with skepticism, which is pretty reasonable. And he says, "Unless I see the wounds myself and I put my fingers in his side, I'm not going to believe it." And the story picks up a week later, that they're again in that same room behind locked doors. And this time Thomas is with them. And Jesus appears again saying, "Peace be with you." And he turns to Thomas and he stretches out his hands and he says, "See, put your fingers here. and he said, "Put your hand in my side." Well, Thomas is overcome, and he says this testimony, "My Lord and my God." And that's about all he can say because he's so astonished at what he sees. I think these stories that we hear are stories that ring true to us in many ways because we meet these stories with the same sort of skepticism and doubt in our understanding of what life is about. The Swiss theologian Karl Barth once said that what continues to bring people to worship today is that unspoken and persistent question that is deep within us: is it true? And we have to ask these questions. Is it true that God established the natural order with all of the constant patterns of environmental cycles and processes? And that the laws that govern conservation of mass and energy were put in place by a God? That all of these patterns that humans have observed over time and that we've developed a scientific method of inquiry that is the basis for our modern understanding of how the world works. Is it true? And if it is true that God did this, then is it also true that this same God who put all of these constant laws of nature in place then suspended them for one morning so that that God could raise that God's self up from a death back into life? Though filled with fear and doubt and skepticism, Mary would say yes, and the other disciples would say yes, and Thomas said yes. That was their testimony to the people in their lives that yes, these things happened. I saw them, I experienced them. And I think there are Christians today also who would say, yes, I've experienced a living, risen Lord as well. The truth and the paradox of life is this: that life does end in death. And yet, when we look at nature, we see also that life emerges from death too. And so I think that many of us would say that we have our own Easter stories to tell about our experience of what it is to live and to be human and to believe in God. You know, these Easter stories are usually called testimonies. Um, Both in the church and in a court of law, we use the word testimony because we're talking about it being a personal, firsthand experience that has some solemn truth to it. It has a level of authenticity to it that reading someone else's story doesn't necessarily have. It's our own story. In my experience of hearing people's testimonies and having them share their stories with me is this: that many times these testimonies are given by people who have decided to devote their life to service and compassion with others. I heard them among people who were doing disaster relief or volunteers and mission teams that were going somewhere to help people. And I heard them among the people that they were helping also, testimonies of how maybe they were living in poverty, but their lives were filled with generosity. Maybe that they were experiencing war and violence in their lives and they were fearful, but even so they had moments of peace that they experienced as well. Whether it was a volunteers and mission team or Engineers Without Borders or Peace Corps, people's lives are changed by the experience of reaching out and giving of their own lives for someone else who's in need. I want to share with you some of these powerful Easter stories. The story of my friend Alcides, recounting the night in Angola when his city Melange was being bombed by the other side of the Civil War. And leaving the shelter of their home, they fled with just what they could carry and the clothes on their back and some food in bags. And they ran into the countryside, trying to take refuge in the forest and in the bush. And as they were running, the teenage Alcides heard a strange mewing sound, he stopped and he looked around, wondering what it was, and he heard it again, and he discovered an infant laying by itself in the grasses. He scooped up the child, refusing to leave it behind, and he ran on with his family. And today, that adopted girl, child of his, is in college, and that city has been experiencing peace for 17 years now. Angola came through a period of civil war that lasted 27 years, and now they've experienced peace for 17 years, and they're still putting their nation back together, a proud nation that has risen out of the ashes of war and destruction. Another story that I'd like to tell you is similar, but it's a personal story that you might have read or could hear of Anne Lamott. She's written many books, and she talks about what it was like growing up as a child where a family didn't go to church, but somehow from a relative, she'd heard about Jesus. And in those times of fear, when she was listening to her parents argue and fight, that she would sense that Jesus was with her. And then later, as an adult, when she was dealing with her own addiction of alcohol, she had a profound experience that changed her life, that she felt the presence of Jesus speaking to her, and then finding a faith community and worshiping with them and being mentored by them. She found her way to a new kind of life, a life filled with faith and wonder, and still with questions and struggles, but a life which was not lived alone, but a life which was lived with the divine mystery. And sometimes our stories may not use God language. They might not use the language of God or Jesus or Spirit, and yet our lives can be changed by a sense of connectedness and belonging to a greater good, a higher power, and doing something that we just feel compelled to do. And so I'd like to share with you one last story of a young man that I knew in Bozeman. He was a quiet, shy young man, but he was involved in a group called Engineers Without Borders. He and other students chartered a student chapter of Engineers Without Borders. And I watched this young man give up some things that he really did need. He went one winter without getting a new coat that was much needed. I saw him sacrificing both purchases that would have made his life easier and also giving of his time to do fundraising so that the students could raise money for airfare and go to Kwesero, Kenya, to dig latrines and build latrines at a school there. And they also created washing stations to improve the sanitation at the school. And later they went back again. The whole College of Engineering got behind this project, and they established running water and wells at that school and in some in the neighborhood of Kwesero, Kenya. And they're continuing on their efforts today. These are all stories of resurrection, of people rising from their circumstances to a better place and a better life. It took me quite a few years to recognize that God was a part of my life too. I talked about that a little bit last week. But one of the questions that I really struggled with was the same question that Jesus asked his disciples then, about 2,000 some years ago, and the same question that we struggle with today. He asked him this: "Who do you say that I am?" That was a question that troubled me. I read a lot and I tried to understand who Jesus was. It was part of my struggling with my doubts in order to find faith. And one of the paradoxes is that when we struggle with our doubts, that is the pathway of faith. And that is the place that we can go to suddenly realize, yes, I do believe. I may still have doubts. I might find this a great mystery, and yet I too have felt a presence in my life. And I too can say, yes, he is risen. He is risen indeed. So Whatever your story is now, I hope that it will become clearer to you. And I urge you to consider struggling with the doubts, to keep your eyes on this person named Jesus, who we have some stories to read, and we also have stories to encounter today. If you read the chapter of John, one of the last parts of the passages says this: Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. I am very well aware of the many stories of people of faith that are not in the Bible. They're of the many generations that came afterward, and they're part of our generation today. And so, in thinking of that story of disciples huddled behind the locked doors that day, that night, and Jesus coming to them, it reminds me so much of the situation that many of us find ourselves now. We might feel locked in. We might be huddled behind closed doors, trying to stay safe in this time of COVID-19. But whether you feel fear and trepidation at this time, I still encourage you to keep your eyes on Jesus and maybe sit down and write some of those important stories that are your stories. Write about your life. Give your testimony. I don't think there's anything that is more precious in our lives than the story that we have. And if you are a parent or a grandparent or you're a friend of a young person, I really encourage you to share your stories with them about what you found important in your life, important stories of what gave your life meaning, and perhaps of how you've encountered divine mystery too. Share that story with them and share the moments that you've had doubts and how you found an answer to the questions that you had as well. Because I think the truth is this, that we learn best from those that we love. We learn about love and faith from those that have faith in us. And so I encourage you to write your stories. Why not start writing your own Easter story today?